All right, so you're all here because of wildfire, and we all know the challenges that we've been facing. What I'm going to do is start by talking about the hard stuff, and that is the insurance industry and insurance issues. So, do you think the insurance companies have noticed that we've lost 43,000 structures in the last decade? In the wildfire space specifically? Yes. Do you think they've noticed that we've had lots of hurricane impacts and increasing hurricane velocities and damage? Yes. And have they noticed tornadoes? Yes. And have they noticed a number of floods? Yes. So all of these things are compounding, and we've been getting lots and lots of information around these being climate-related issues. And so we're in a really awkward moment in insurance right now. I'm curious, if you're willing, how many of you don't have homeowners insurance? Right, because we mostly have owner-built homes, and we live in a slightly different way that we've structured our existences, and I get that. But how many of you know somebody that's lost their insurance? Right? Okay, so what I'm going to try and do is make you ambassadors to understand what's happening in the insurance issues. So insurance is really actually a climate risk strategy. It's this promise that there's someone who could be there to help you in those most difficult times. And it's part of our wildfire protection strategies because sometimes, something goes wrong and we are not able to protect the structure or to protect some of our assets. But when we think about wildfire protection, we're thinking about in this landscape of issues. And so many of you are wildland firefighters and you're volunteer firefighters, you're part of the fire response team, and that's where a lot of our effort in Southern Humboldt has been for many decades, has been building this really great and talented workforce of volunteers that are there for us. And I just want to say my hat's off to all of you who do support, do contribute, do attend, because the work that you've done has really made a difference for many of us. Now, we, from a public policy perspective, have thought about building codes, where to build, how to have access, how do we create safe communities, and how have we done on that front in Southern Humboldt? Maybe not so good, right? It's been a little loosey-goosey. How many of you live down single-lane access roads? I'm one of those. I'm down a 4.5-mile road. Yeah, there's no hope for me. I'm not leaving, because there's no way to get out that's going to be easy. And had the August fire done what we thought it might have been able to do, sure, I was right in the line of that. So it's a complicated thing to think about once you've built all these structures in all these places. So we also have spent a lot of time talking about wildland management, right? And now we've got the Humboldt County Resource Conservation District, engaged in a really nice way. We've really tried to scale up. We talk a lot about pace and scale. And so those are components that we're trying to address to be able to manage some types of wildfire. So it's this whole landscape of responses and whole landscape of strategies that are part of what we need to be working on. So the insurance piece, though, has been a component that we were hoping would be there for us. But they're in a period of readjustment, and I think we've established why that has occurred. But we keep getting knocked off. Think about Lahaina and Maui last year. Most people said it couldn't happen here, there's no way that it could happen here. But that they had a fire very similar to this in the 1960s. We all know a history of wildland fire, and especially when we have environments which can have pretty significant wind events. So the question I have for you is, did Lahaina affect California? Absolutely, right? It's another location where you can't imagine that it could occur here. What about all the fires that we had in Washington and Oregon over the last couple of years? Those are affecting our framework and how we think about these issues. So all of this is compounding together to be able to create some significant challenges. So do you all know that we have a Department of Insurance? Right, so that came about through Proposition 103 in the late 80s and created an official commissioner. Most states have an insurance commissioner. And our insurance commissioner is really responsible for a whole number of things, but for this component, he and his team, or she and her team, if it was a female executive, work through reviewing rate filings and trying to basically do consumer protection for us. And part of the reason that the Department of Insurance was created is because rates were skyrocketing and there was no real mechanism for consumer protection. So we have a government entity that's capable of trying to structure that, But it has also been controlled by this proposition, which has made it difficult to move more quickly, to be more nimble. And one of the things that Prop 103 did is it said that rates have to be dependent on past experiences, that we can't have futures forecasting, that we need to think about past events to be able to inform how we move forward. That was fine until about a decade ago when everything changed and we started having a number of very significant community losses. And so the insurance companies have been saying, you know, we can't understand this. We want to be able to use future predictions. We want to be able to use computer models. We want to be able to sort of have a more clear understanding of where risk exists and where it doesn't. And through this proposition, that has been difficult. So what has been occurring is that the governor and the insurance commissioner have been trying to figure out what authorities both of them have in this space. And recently the governor issued an executive order which enabled, or is enabling, the insurance commissioner to issue emergency regulations and try and work quickly at this issue. They're only temporary. When you issue an emergency regulation, they're only temporary. So all of this, what I'm trying to say, is going to continue to be dynamic. And if you want something more certain, this is not the topic to pay attention to, because it's not going to be that way. So, you know, Maui clearly had an impact. Will we see other big losses this year? I mean, 2023 was a relatively quiet fire season. We had the largest fire in the North Coast on record. You know where that was? The Smith River Complex. Did we lose any structures in the Smith River Complex? One. But did we take an entire community and lose their economy for an entire month? 100%. So, complicated things. Anyway, and then what keeps happening is that the reinsurers, anybody know what a reinsurer is? You do?
They pass insurance premium, they go through a different set of insurance. So they'll get an insurance policy from a bigger one, but then put it through and it's not under the same regulation.
Close. So if you're an insurance company, you might need insurance too to be able to manage your risk. So there are bigger and bigger groups that are connected to the insurance space. So most of the companies that we have in the United States are national carriers, are admitted carriers, are US companies. The reinsurers tend to be international companies and they aggregate other insurers underneath them. Reinsurers get the pass-through when our national companies have loss. They therefore get the loss, and so it keeps getting translated up. So what they are doing is they are adding additional costs to the price of insurance for the insurance companies. So there's this passing the buck element that keeps happening, and we've seen rates that have gone between 25 and 40% increases for the insurance companies in the last several years. So each year they're getting that compounding kind of interest rate. So for those of you that have insurance policies, how much have your rates gone up, excluding the FAIR plan? Yours went up double, but not the FAIR plan, right? So my insurance in Arcata has gone up like 1%. Yet this is the kind of pass-through that's coming down from the reinsurers onto the insurers. So it's a complicated piece in that we've got the insurance commissioner that's in the middle of that, trying to buffer us, but there are all these other external forces happening in the economic space. So what do the insurers want? So you probably have heard of something called the FAIR plan, and I'll describe that in more detail in a minute. But the FAIR plan is the insurance plan of last resort. And as I said, it's been around for a long time, and it really came out of the the LA riots in the 60s. And so we created this plan that basically created a system where insurers managed the risk of those that became uninsurable. So I think of it like in a life insurance framework, we put all the sick people into this special plan, and we're hoping that there's enough people in there that are healthy enough to be able to manage that risk. And so what we're doing is we're essentially putting those that are viewed from at least an insurance perspective as being more risky into this special place. And in that special place of insurance plans, those who bear the cost of them are the insurers. So if State Farm owns 20% of the market, they're responsible for 20% of the losses as a pool within that population group of FAIR plan users. So as FAIR plans, policyholders have been skyrocketing, the risk becomes greater because it's mostly the people that are viewed as owning properties that are more difficult to manage, and so there are higher and higher risks associated with that. So insurers want some way to be able to manage the costs of the FAIR plan. In Florida, by comparison, it's the consumers that manage or bear responsibility for the losses, not the insurers themselves. Do we want that for us? That means as consumers, we're pretty vulnerable to everybody else's conditions. So in some ways, from a consumer protection perspective, we're doing better by not being directly attached to the payout on the FAIR plan. But the FAIR plan is not structured very well and financially is quite vulnerable. So if we end up with a massive loss, maybe in Santa Cruz County again, because that's where a bunch of the cancellations are occurring, or maybe in the foothills of the Sierras, like we could bankrupt the FAIR plan pretty fast. So that's difficult. The insurers also want to use something called risk modeling, which is that predictive modeling to be able to use data to inform rates and decision making. And the insurance commissioner has said yes towards risk modeling. There's been some hearings recently, and they're trying to figure that out. So what does that mean? It means big data. Big data on all of our properties. And what's not clear is kind of what the level of transparency will be to us as consumers as to what big data they're using and whether they can accurately see what our conditions are. And so that's going to be different. It's going to be quite different. They already have lots of data on us. I learned the other day that they even know like what magazines we buy and kind of what our consumer behaviors are. So that's used as part of the analysis on whether we're a good investment or not. And then they also want some mechanism to be able to manage the cost of reinsurance. So lots of things in play. What the Department of Insurance has primarily done is set up the Safer from Wildfires program, if you might have heard of that, which is creating a discount essentially for different types of mitigation work. So that can be either home hardening related actions or actions associated with defensible space or community engagement. So, being a fire-wise community is one of those criteria. And the insurers are basically making proposals to which of those mitigations they're going to give credit towards. And the insurance commissioner is reviewing those right now. So the FAIR plan is the first to come in with clear rates associated with those discounts. And they come in about, anyone seen that discount on their FAIR plan policy?
Supposed to be 15% for Firewise?
That's right. So it's a pretty small number. It's 15%, and then you add the reinsurance costs on there. So basically, insurance is going up and up and up, and with that little bit of discount, it may stabilize us a little bit. So it's the first step in that direction, and there should be a whole lot more plans coming soon that will give credit towards that mitigation work. And the insurance commissioner is really focused also on consumer protection and trying to figure out how to create a system that doesn't bankrupt the state, keeps everything flowing, is realistic in this space. And so I don't have the magic formula on how to solve these issues, but here's some of the language that's occurring, some of the issues. So what do you do now to think about these issues? So here's some of the big pictures. We don't know exactly where the non-renewals are. We heard just 2 weeks ago or so that State Farm was going to issue some more non-renewals, and the San Francisco Chronicle was able to figure out where those non-renewals were, and they happen to be occurring in a lot of previous fire footprints. So the insurance commissioner has mandated that insurers don't immediately cancel policies in a place where there's been a recent wildfire, given consumers a year to be able to hold on and be stable. But now that that has expired, we're basically seeing cancellations coming into Santa Cruz, some around the North Bay complex fires, around the Tubbs fire in those areas, and a whole bunch in the Sierra foothills. So from a public policy perspective, we don't know where people are, and what we kind of assume is that there's about 30 to 40% of the population that doesn't have a mortgage, and so they are likely to be folks that are bare, which is the term, and that's generally considered to be folks that are more vulnerable, more socioeconomically vulnerable if they've been able to live in their home long enough to pay it off, but maybe are on fixed income because of their age. So, the point in all of this is that there's a risk all across California, and the kinds of conversations that are happening in Sacramento is trying to really figure out how do you calculate that risk, how do you manage that risk, how do you make it predictive, and then how do we give credit for the action that's being taken place. So, how do you all, because I look at you all as many of you are train the trainers here, many of you are leaders in your community, and I hope after today's conversation you can bring back a few ideas that might be useful to your neighbors and to your friends and to your family. And part of the challenge is trying to figure out how to recognize risk, how to see it on our own properties, how to understand it. And at this point, we are probably in a group of people that have a higher vocabulary, more fluency in this topic. But if you think the insurance companies aren't paying attention and don't understand these things, they have skyrocketed while we've been just trying to hang on and just trying to become more conversant and understand this. So, I talk to a lot of folks and they're like, it's not my risk, it's really my neighbor. If my neighbor had only done such and such and such and such, then I would be fine. And there's kind of this game of like, well, who's going to take the first move? And I guess what I would encourage people to think about it should be us that takes the first move. We need to lead by example and be clear that we take responsibility for our own stuff and just wait for someone else to try and jump into the conversation. So the other piece that I want to recognize, and that is to really document your mitigations. Like, I don't know if you ever had an old flip book of like your property, and here's the first bird song of the year, or here's the first flower, here's or a baby book, right, where you kind of keep track of those milestones. In our properties, that's just as important at this point now. So if you are having a conversation with your insurer, you could come in with that flip book and say, this is what it looks like around my house. This is what I've done. These are the types of actions I've done. And that will go a long way in basically verifying that you are a good partner worth investing in. A woman sent me a letter just this week from Independence, Inyo County, and she had this checklist of things that she needed to prove up and verify with photographs to be able to hold on to her insurance policy. It just came this week. Are you ready for that? What happens when someone comes and looks, at how you organize your place, where you store stuff, how you think about those pathways, that conductivity of fuel in both built structures as well as vegetation to the property. These are the kinds of things that we're going to need to be able to demonstrate. I don't think most of us are really that comfortable with it. I don't think there are many uptakes on people that, I don't know if you all got those options to have a regulator, a data tracker on how much you speed or don't speed. You remember that from the auto insurance space? Did anyone choose to share that data? No, we don't really want people to know that kind of stuff. We're in that space now. The insurers need to understand how we live and how we take care of stuff. And having that flip book is going to be really key to be able to market your property in the future, to think about transfer from one generation to the next. All of this is kind of a new era of how we live in California. So I don't know if you know, have you ever heard of AB 38 disclosures? Dave, you have? Anyone else? So anyone thinking about selling their home or thinking about buying a home, what now comes is basically a disclosure that you need. In this case, it would be our state fire agency, so it'd be CAL FIRE that would come in and do the disclosure work, which documents the defensible space work that has occurred on the property. And so that when you buy the property next, you are as an informed consumer about what has occurred. In another year, home hardening requirements are also going to be kicked into that disclosure process. And I think it's really lovely, just to be honest, because when you're in the transactional space, when you're either buying or selling, most of us don't care about the condition of the house. We just want to close the deal. We just want to finish it and get it done. And it's a place where people are less attached to the way things are and are more willing to do a few pieces of work so that we can finalize that deal. So it's kind of an interesting time period where we may see a bunch of work come about, and it's also an interesting place where developing more crews and skill labor to be able to help homeowners finish that transactional work could be really neat. So it's coming. It's coming in more detail than you may be aware of, but I think it's an interesting strategy. That clip is, so let's keep going. So FAIR Plan, if you don't understand the way the FAIR Plan works. So the FAIR Plan basically just covers fire, and then you have to get what's called a DIC, or difference in condition secondary policy, which covers the liability, the theft, the water damage, those kinds of pieces. So if you know someone who's lost their insurance, they're basically going to their insurance company, trying to get a FAIR Plan policy and trying to match that with a difference in condition policy, and together that equals comprehensive coverage, which is what you would need for a mortgage. So it's a new system, it's a new way of working, and what we want is not to have people in this space for very long, that it's a temporary refuge and then people move out of that and go back into the standard insurance. So how do you think we all rank in insurance policies in California relative to the other states? Are we most expensive, least expensive, somewhere in the middle? What do you think? You think we're highest? Anyone else vote for highest? We got a few highest. What if I told you we were 13th from the top? Do you know what the average policy is in California for insurance? About $1,800 a year. In Florida and hurricane country, what do you think the average policy is? $5,500. In Tornado Alley, it's about $4,500. We've gotten quite comfortable with relatively inexpensive insurance compared to other places that have high frequency of natural disasters. So, even Oregon and Washington pay more money than we do. I'm not saying that I want to pay more money for insurance, but it's kind of interesting just to see that relative perspective and where we sit. Question?
Doesn't that depend on where you live in the state?
So the question is, doesn't that depend on where you live in the state? If you're subject to the FAIR Plan because you've lost all other insurance options, 100%. But by and large, what our typical home and home value and rate policy is in that category. Will the risk modeling, predictive modeling start to change and differentiate that? Probably. And at this point, just the frank answer is affordability is not the primary goal. Availability is the primary goal at this point, because we need to at least keep people that have that risk protection. So I brought a whole bunch of different stuff here, and the ladies laid out a bunch of my little kit stuff, and I have some information on different ways to think about these issues and where we can get some consumer protection and stuff. So for those that might be struggling in the insurance space or struggling on a fixed income, we're encouraging folks to shop around, but it's also, when you want to open that trigger of your insurance is a complicated thing. What some folks are doing is they're increasing their deductibles and just basically trying to get to the calamity stage. I have insurance for calamity, and after that, I can weather it and I can work it through. I talked a little bit earlier about making your home attractive to underwrite. So this idea of keeping track of the information you do, being more organized and prepared, and documenting what you've got done would be very helpful to be able to come in and say, help me think through my fire score. Here's the things I've done. What more do I need to do to appease your interests? And so there are a couple of programs that are trying to create standards for folks to work from, and one is the Insurance Commissioner's Safer from Wildfire program. That's that discount model that I was talking about. I'm not showing the slides for all of those, but there are about 20 different actions that you can take, and they work from the home scale and home hardening to the defensible space and to the community preparedness and organizational space. So it's kind of about 3 different bins that folks can work in. And then there's also a private business called the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, and they have developed a wildfire prepared model. It has different grades, and you can have a third party come in and assess the property and see if it matches that standard. What I have heard is that there are 2 insurance companies out of about 100 in California that are now mandating the wildfire prepared home assessment, and we may see insurers move in that general direction. The wildfire prepared home is got some great ideas in there. It's a pretty high bar, and most of us, I don't think, will pass that high bar at this point. And then we've got, we have FireWise designations here. That's a great way to structure and document and verify that your community has come together, which you all have done. So I want to just identify a really important player in this, and that is United Policyholders, and I have some of their resources here. So they are a consumer advocacy organization. So if you know someone that's gotten dropped from insurance and they don't know where to start, they don't know what to do, I've got some of their materials, but you can also go to their website and there's a very clear set of actions, what you can do, what happens when your insurance is dropped, and who do you go to and where do you get help. So, and then there's also something called the low-cost retrofit list, which has informed a number of those other organizations' review process, but it's also a neat way just to go in and sort of look at, well, what are the standards? What are people really asking us to do? How can I think about those actions, and what might be my first choices? What might be easy? What might be expensive? What should I be working towards? So any questions on insurance? Yes?
Should your insurance company give you a wildfire safety score?
So the insurance companies they've got all kinds of proprietary models where they're assessing your property and running it through their score, and there are elements of that you can understand, and so there are elements that we don't get to see. So we don't know exactly what's triggering those risk evaluations because it's not publicly transparent data. And that's where this sort of risk modeling framework is coming about, is trying to think a little bit more in that space. And then there's a whole group of folks that are trying to create a data commons, which would be a socially accessible, available data set where your property information could be visible and you could look at it. And what's not clear is how you could then go in and say, hey, well, that's not quite right. I actually have done these things. How do we update that enough? I think from our perspective as those that are community organizers, I mean, we also need to see how everybody's doing in our community and find those that are having a hard time and figure out how we can lift those folks and be able to think coherently as a group, because, you know, I'm not going to deny that the condition of the neighbor's property has an influence on the condition of your property, and so we're kind of in this together. Okay, last question.
Well, because my experience is that insurance companies that I've dealt with just say your zip code is wrong.
Right.
They don't, I mean, Eureka's zip code is wrong, Redway's zip code is wrong. You're like, okay, I can't mitigate the entire area. I'm trying to just deal with my one.
Right, so there's this comment about how we're seeing zip codes being the mechanism for dropping, and it's maybe an easier way to do it. It doesn't mean it makes it easier for us either, but that's this point of this very awkward space that we're in right now. Any other questions on insurance? Dave?
Who does the assessments for the wildfire prepared home?
So the question is, who does the assessments for the wildfire prepared home? They have to be people that have gone through their training, and it might be something that those of us who are interested in that space could learn how to do and meet the criteria. At this point, I think it's mostly been their own staff. They've only done a few of them in California at this point. Like, it's just kind of coming on. Christina. So the question is how, what's going into these models and what data feeds into that, and how do those models yield the answer that they're looking for. And I don't know the answer for 100% of these, but the more that we're organized, the better off we're going to be. I'm not going to promise that will give us the answer. Like, does our community wildfire protection plan need to be up to speed? I don't think it's at that scale at this point, but we're trying to aggregate ourselves and look good as a community in general, and that has some influence. All right, anything else on the insurance space? Okay, why are you here? What do you want to learn? And the rest of it, what would be good for you to know? Can you afford to live here, as in southern?
In Northern California, which is one of the most expensive areas in the country, and have fire insurance, along with all the other expenses that come to stick to living in. And that's basically why I came.
Right.
I can't make a decision if I could live here.
Right. That's a super hard question. Can you afford to live here, given your income, given your expenses, given building costs? I mean, another big factor that's associated with all of this is our cost of rebuilding and our cost of building. It's far more expensive here than it is in other places in the United States. And that has a big influence on the amount of money that goes forward for recovery and lifting people back up. I can't answer that question for you. It's a hard one. At this point,
For example, my fire insurance is my biggest bill.
Yeah.
It's outrageous. You know, when you were saying California's affordable, I mean, honestly, I pay 15 grand a year in fire insurance.
I'm not saying that California is affordable. I'm just saying that we sit in a different place respective to other states. And
You can understand when you get to that point, you start to have a panic attack. Oh my God, are you kidding me?
sure.
So it's just double mine, and now it's like important.
I mean, I'll be honest, you know what keeps me up at night? I think this could drive our whole state off the cliff at this point, right? It is so tied in, you know, our biggest assets are really our properties, and that's where we've made most of our investment. And if we can't buy or if we can't sell those, we can't move a workforce, we can't realize the value we have, and we're in a very precipitous place. And the question is, what are we willing to give on to be able to rebuild a system that makes some sense, that deals with, you know, and protects our interests, but that we are a reliable partner, we are a reliable consumer, and we are doing what we can to be able to manage and mitigate our hazards. I mean, I'll be straight up. I looked out the window just right up here at whatever structures are over there, and they terrify me. So let's talk a little bit more about the built environment and what we have at risk. So how many people got the alert on the night of the August fire and its big blow up? A few of us, right? And what went through your mind at that point? Was there an oh shit moment? What were you worried about, and were you ready? I have a cabin that has to defend itself on its own and has to be in good shape. And it was 5 miles from the fire front, and it was quite interesting for me to get to that cabin several weeks later after I could get back in. And what I noticed when I opened my front door was this giant plume of ash that had blown around and had been on my deck and blew right into underneath my front door. Thank goodness it was cool ash, right? Could it have been hot ash? Easily. So now what do I do when I leave that cabin in the summer in fire season? I take some bitumen tape and I actually seal up the base of the door. I spend 15 cents on foil tape to seal up the edge of my door. Is that going to be a guarantee that it's going to work? No, but it's a very simple way to keep the ash out from blowing underneath my door. There's a lot of other things I could do with weather stripping, but at least this is a first step. So having something like this kind of tape to be able to seal up those gaps, seal up those vulnerable places when you need to evacuate on quick notice is part of being aware of what's happening. So if you see dust accumulating stuff in places, you see where the leaves accumulate, these are all little nooks and crannies where embers can land. So it's really nice when you have some warning and you have a sense that, you know, there's like the car fire in Reading, that it was coming our direction, that it was coming our way. You know, people had several days to be able to think about it. Most people just couldn't believe that it could happen here. So when the Tubbs fire, do you guys remember the Santa Rosa fire? And the Redwood Valley fire, where did the first power line go down that evening?
East side of the mountain.
First power line went down in Blue Lake at 3:30 in the afternoon. We still had a helicopter, we still had crews, we had resources. What would have happened if our power line went down at 3 in the morning? Like it did in Redwood Valley, and actually came down a little earlier than that. It's all sequencing. Sequencing matters in terms of where we sit and how much crew availability we have. A lot of folks, you know, in the north part of Humboldt County don't see themselves in the space, they don't see their vulnerability, but it's really how it stacks and how many resources we have left behind to be able to work through these issues. So, and I think, you know, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but these are the graphics that we thought about from a defensible space perspective in 2006, the last time we updated the defensible space codes. And, you know, they kind of work for us. A lot of us live in Douglas fir forests in southern Humboldt. A lot of us live in a wood structure. But does this graphic work for California? No, it says that wildfire occurs in a forest, and it says that we all live in log cabins. And so what we've built up is this sort of cultural dissonance around the fact that forest fire is what's going to get us, and if we live in a log cabin, that's how we're going to perish. And so as long as we do a little bit with our tree work, we can mitigate that problem. And so we're having to do a massive readjustment right now because of this perception that we lose most of the homes in forest fire conditions, which is not true. We actually lose most homes in the United States in different types of vegetation-related fires. A lot of grasslands, a lot of oak woodlands, a lot of chaparral fires. Certainly we lose homes in environments where we have forests, but that's not the dominant system. And the idea here was that if you separate the trees and you reduce the ladder fuels, that you won't get a fire that climbs up into the crown, and so it'll be easier to do what? To defend that structure. So next slide. And so what we've been trying to communicate is this idea that there's going to be someone who's going to save us and that it's going to be safe for them to be there. And in reality, when we get, a fire that has a lot of wind behind it, and especially a lot of homes, we don't have the resources to be able to defend those structures. So where do our crews go? They work on evacuation, and how do our homes sit in that situation? Undefended and by themselves, and there's a lot that we can always regret. So what we're about, Tanner, you can flip me, is really trying to articulate what these types of exposures are. So on the left, you see something called direct flame contact. And what that's trying to illustrate is that you can mitigate the pathway of a fire coming from outside the property towards the structure. And there's things that you can do very specifically around defensible space that limits that wicking or that pathway of movement. But we know we have two other types of exposures that few people are able to articulate, and one of those are embers, which are becoming more and more common. They're firebrands, they're bits of vegetation that get picked up in the air column, and they move long distances, they start spot fires, they move out in front of the flaming front, and they can find vulnerabilities on our buildings, they can find vulnerabilities through and into the buildings, and they can also create spot fires directly touching the structure. One of the most significant things is radiant heat. And radiant heat is where you actually don't have direct flame contact. You have something ignited and burning close to the structure that creates heat transfer, and that heat transfer causes some type of failure in the primary building. We most often see that in windows. And we can have a window pane break, or we can have the glazing come out and then the panes fall out and then the second pane breaks. And so thinking about all structures on the property or all places where there could be a lot of concentration of heat from the vegetation or the structure is part of becoming fire adapted. So being able to prepare for direct flame contact, embers, and radiant heat is the formula. And every one of our structures look a little different, don't they? Every one has a little bit more vulnerability in one way than another, and every one of these things can be mitigated. So this is a photo from the LA Times, and it's new construction. I don't know how well you can see it from here, it's a little washed out, but there's some interesting things occurring right here. So this is an ember storm, and we have, I don't know if it's local, probably is local fire responding. And what are they responding to? What do you guys see there? Wind's moving things around. What's this? It's grass, some kind of decorative grass that's burning. Why is it so hot right at the base of that wall? Why in that white to yellow? What's going on there? So gutter, vegetation, what else?
Wood chips.
Wood chips, embers drifting. So the answer is, you can see that the air is actually being moved this direction. So the embers are being thrown against that wall, and the wall's not sticky, so they hit the wall and they drop to the base, and they concentrate and accumulate right at the base of the wall. Anybody have anything that could burn at the base of their wall of their house right now? Your doormat? A whole lot of stuff, right? So this is wooded mulch. This is new construction. We just added a whole bunch of mulch around it. We created a little beauty, a little nice walkway. And And so when we talk about defensible space, we often talk about work in this horizontal place outside from the structure, especially like the first 5 feet. But we also talk about this 6 inches of vertical clearance. And it makes a lot of sense when you have a perimeter foundation, it's easier to accomplish. But that's because that's this concentration point where you put a lot of burning material right there, and it's right at that transition point and really easy to create ignition there. There's also some other interesting things going on. Do you guys notice this pattern right here by that door, and then this pattern by this door? What's happening? Wind, right? Do you know why this one is swirling this way and that one is going that way? Totally. So it's the physics of the way that this building is structured, and we don't know anything more than what we see in this photograph here, but you get different air currents in different directions depending on how the walls come together. And so we often talk about the under-eave area of a building as being vulnerable. Well, over here it certainly illustrates that, doesn't it? Because you can see that you're getting this vertical column, this vertical circulation. And if you had something that's quite flammable there, you've created a new ember ignition generator, and you've got the wind that continues to pump those embers in this vertical way. Over here, you've certainly got the horizontal swirling, and I think that's what we tend to see more commonly, especially like if you have inside corners, there's always leaves that collect right there. There's a spot that you sweep out and do different stuff. Well, that's exactly where the embers are gonna go. So making sure those eddies that you typically see around your building are protected from, that don't have a lot of things that it can ignite, because you create this immediate spot fire on or adjacent to your structure. So this is embers. They're insidious. They can find the smallest spaces. Is there anything that could be done differently to release this person's time? You could remove the vegetation. You could at least remove the bark mulch, right? Do we need the bark mulch there? I mean, it's pretty, but it's putting us at great vulnerability. I mean, the sad part to me is that the structure was built now, and there's this whole focus of where the non-combustible zone is in the middle, right? You could easily have the sidewalks work around the center, work around the outside, and then have some kind of focal point that you could come into and look at. It could be a fountain, it could be statuary, it even could be some form of vegetation, as long as it doesn't have direct connectivity to the structure. So living in a fire-adapted way means thinking a little differently and managing our aesthetics. It doesn't mean everything has to be ugly. It just means we have to think a little differently than we do now. So California is changing their defensible space standards and bringing in a new zone which extends 5 feet out and 6 inches up. And does it make sense after you see this? Yeah. Is it going to be hard? Yeah. But it's what's happening, and you can understand when you see something like this, that if our home is undefended and we've got all this fuel basically all around nestled in every little nook and cranny, then we're likely to burn, right? So this work comes in part from actual firefighter observations as well as empirical testing. And what I want to show you is a lab in South Carolina that's managed by the insurance company for business and home safety. And they have a really cool facility, big enough to put a structure in it, big enough to put a bunch of wind turbines on there which you can modulate the air currents. So in this case, they're going to run a test with oscillating 20 to 30 mile an hour gusts. And then they have an ember generator, which is simulating the idea that there's a wildfire producing embers and throwing them. It doesn't look much different than we just saw in that earlier photo, does it? Because here you can see the concentration line right at the base of the wall, and you can see how the embers are pushing up. You can see the air currents. You can see a number of things. What I find interesting is to look at this corner, and do you see that they spray out farther? So corners are very vulnerable. So if you were to choose some place to skimp and put some extra flower beds and extra stuff, don't do it on the corner, because the corner gets a bigger spray effect from the way that the embers run into the building and then spray out. And so what I'm going to show you next, and will you stop it just right there for a second? Oh, you should be able to just click it. Okay, so I'm going to show you a side-by-side comparison. This is from inside their lab. And they've set up a little neat experiment. And probably many of you have seen this before, right? Yeah. No? Okay, a few of you. It's kind of cool. So what this is one half of the building is some kind of rock with a wood deck and then cement board on the siding. And then the other half is same wood deck, but some kind of combustible mulch and then wood siding. I wish they'd let me design the experiment, because there's too many things changing it here. The only thing that's held constant between this is the wood deck and the wood deck. So when we run the visual, when we run the 1 minute slide, what I want you to do is pay attention to the deck, because the deck is the only thing that's held constant. I would really like to see the wood siding with a non-combustible rock and the deck. And I would argue that it would turn out exactly as the outcome with the cement board and the rock. Because most fires they don't start on the wall, they start on the horizontal and then they run into the vertical, right? You guys have seen this? So, okay, spoiler alert, the house on the left is gonna burn. It's fair enough, right? This video is gonna take 60 seconds. So I wanna ask you a question. How long does it take to get fire response to your community? More than 60 seconds, right? Is it a fair comparison that this is dry mulch that's sitting on a cement pad? How much moisture would likely be there if it's on native soil? Maybe a little more. Do you get fire response in 6 minutes? No, you don't get fire response in 6 minutes. Do you get fire response in 6 hours? Yeah, that's good, that's good. So what of this can you control, right? You can't control the fire response. You may not be able to control the moisture level because you may be gone for some time period, your irrigation doesn't work, a number of pieces, or it's a really dry year and you can't irrigate. So this is about fire adaptation. So take it away. Oh, you gotta go back and hit the... So here we are in just a few seconds and we already have ignition underneath the deck. So it ignites the combustible mulch. You can see the flames start to penetrate right underneath the door. Look at the cement board comparison. There's no ignition there. In 20 seconds, we have flames that are running up the side of the house, which are running into the under eave area and starting to put pressure on the gable end vent in really 30 seconds. The process can happen super quick. So the point in all of this is trying to think about, well, what is within our control and how much of this fuel can we manage? Even if we assume that it's a little bit moisture in our environment and that we might have some green plants in there that might help mitigate some of that, having dry stuff around that is flammable is putting us in very dangerous territory. Another example, so this is from Paradise, California, and this is a set of aerial images in the post-fire environment. So what do you guys know about the campfire? A lot. It was devastating, right? 18,000 structures, lots and lots of life was lost. Power line came down. What time did the power line come down? 5:30 in the morning. It was November 3rd. What's happening with the vegetation in November? We had leaf drop. What type of vegetation is Paradise situated in? Pine and California black oak, so a little mixed conifer, a lot of black oak in there. I remember that day I went for a hike in the Arcata Community Forest, and I remember going, oh, crunchy. The redwood needles are crunchy. We were in condition to burn that day. It was a red flag warning. Everybody knew it. Everybody was prepped. They had crews staged. They were ready to go. And so you get an ignition, and it carries pretty quickly. You've got 30 to 40 mile an hour gusts, not Lahaina gusts, not the Boulder, Colorado fire. You get pretty moderate gusts. And so you know that we get embers that are spotting. There's all kinds of things that happen there. When I look at the photograph, especially the one on the left, and it's a little bit blown out in here, where do you see the burned trees?
Around the houses.
Next to the houses, right? So here's a strip over here that's kind of by the roadway, and you have green trees. What's interesting to me is that the homes were the most combustible part of that landscape. It wasn't a crown fire. It was surface fire a lot of it mitigated. There are a lot of fuel reduction work, but you've got vulnerabilities in those structures, and once you get an ignition of one, then you get this shadow effect. So the lot sizes were about 1.5 acres. They're pretty big lot sizes, room to go. But what you can see is just this interrelationship, how one building can have impact across the other buildings. So it's not meant to be a depressing message, but it is really meant to think about how we work together as communities and what we can do. So what we learned is that 73% of the homes are within 54 feet of a destroyed structure. And so that 50-foot demarcation tended to be the best predictor of loss and survival. So does anyone have a combustible structure within 50 feet of their primary structure? Anyway, your wood shed, tool shed, carport, shed, right? There's so many things, and we have to think about of all those structures being maintained to the same standard as the primary one because of the domino effect. Even if that shed is not worth very much to you, it could put impact on the primary structure. And you can see on the right, this is also from Paradise. It was leaf drop, that's the beautiful color of those kind of artsy looking photographs. But if a block is able to hold together, that's so much better because it's really about the interrelationships between these structures, and you can think of it from an epidemiological perspective. So I just want to show you some damage on homes just to kind of give you some sense of what this stuff looks like. Does a home ever self-extinguish once it's been ignited? No. So this means that every one of these buildings likely had firefighter response on them. There was relatively little response in Paradise because of the focus on trying to get all those folks out of the way and a whole lot of other things. But here you can see on the upper left, fence to wall. Can you envision that there was a fence that went along the top of that retaining wall, and then it had a connection point in between the valley and the gap, and then you can see the burn mark on the left, and then the under eaves totally charred. Here's vegetation to house, so you can see that the fascia was damaged and that we had somewhat of a fire on the roof. On the right there, that's radiant heat to a wall and window, and I don't know if the light will allow you to see this, but that's a full broken window. Those are aluminum windows. I can't tell if they're single or double pane at this point. Here is bark mulch to the wall, so it ran up on the corner there, right underneath where the gutter went. In the center lower is a gutter fire, and then on the right-hand side, it's just a bunch of, I think it's too washed out to see it, but a lot of stuff stored next to our structures. We're just coming out of winter, we're just coming out of rain. Anybody got anything stored right around their buildings? Yeah, right. Anyone plan to move that? It's a good idea. Okay, so it's just the little pieces, the little details. That house probably could have survived the gutter fire. I'm not too worried about that. But the fence to wall, and they got into the non-combustible under eave area, no, I think that house would have gone. This bark mulch to wall, I think that house probably would have gone in that case here. Hard to say exactly with the flammables that were near that other structure. So I also had the privilege of going to the east side of the Rocky Mountains into the Springfield communities, and I was part of a team trying to figure out, okay, you can see a whole row of homes that are gone and then many homes around it that are standing, so why is that? Why did those buildings survive and these buildings did not? So that we were part of a team trying to answer that question. And so this is from a drone, so we're using some drone photography to try and understand what was happening here. We spent some time with the community and talked to the neighbors and got a sense of what the stepwise protection was, and then also used some cameras. People had a lot of camera monitoring, and so we were able to reconstruct through some of that process. And then Tanner, I'll let you flip the slide there. And really, what we learned, it was that this labyrinth of wood fences that connected those buildings to each other. So it's a grassland fire with grassland embers. So do grassland embers travel very far? No, they don't. They're pretty light. They don't have a lot of material in them, so they tend to self-extinguish, and they don't move very far compared to some kind of woody vegetation, which is going to pick up and it's going to spin for a while, and it can more easily spot fire. So what we had is we had grassland fire, which then had embers, but they didn't travel very far, that hit those fences, fall to the ground, base of the fence. There's a little bit of debris there. That debris is enough to start a spot fire, and then it's able to ignite the fence, and then the fence runs what directly to? The house, right? So we have this way that we've connected, this way that we've built to create privacy and protection for all the right reasons, but we've got a wick, basically, that runs one building to the next. And so that was one of the major mechanisms of transmission of the fire. What prevented those homes from the homes of loss and survivorship was essentially just firefighter response. And it was back to the old simple thing of kicking over fences, using garden hoses, using this, the small tools to be able to basically break that pathway and prevent loss from the next to the next. I can't remember exactly where I am. I know we're in Springfield somewhere, and this is a new condo subdivision. What I just want to show you is how building products make a difference, because it's more than just a lab. It's like here's them in actual performance. So the fire hit this area about 8 o'clock at night, and the firefighters had decided to use that walking path as their holding line, and they wanted to keep it from going to the next rows, because it was many deep rows of condos here. These are built in about 2000, so they're new. They have a variety of different building products on them. You can imagine that with that row going, there was a lot of radiant heat, and that was maybe 40 feet, I would say, from wall to wall, but a lot of heat. And here on the top left, which corresponds to that photo over there, you can see tempered glass, which is the sliding glass doors, versus annealed glass. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is that the annealed glass breaks and the tempered glass does not. So why do we use tempered glass?
Safety.
It's safety glass, right? Anyone accidentally walked through a window before or a door? Yeah, it was bad, wasn't it? So it breaks differently, but it also has a heat treatment in there, and it has more heat-resistant properties than annealed glass does. You don't need to worry about ingress and egress on those daylight windows on top of the sliders, so that's why they're annealed glass. But the annealed glass has a third less heat-resistive qualities, and so just a neat little comparison of one versus the other. So in places where you have buildings that are close to each other, structures where you might have a radiant heat element, upgrading that window along that shared line to tempered glass could make a big difference. It's a very, it's a getting in front of the issue. And then just some more other visuals of kind of once the window goes, then you've got these vinyl blinds and you can see them melting. I was fascinated by it. This is facade, right? But like the facade was actually damaged from all the heat, and you could see different resins coming out of it. It was pretty wild. And then I just want to bring a couple more points home. This is, again, in that same community in Colorado. And here is rock mulch. So here's a walkway with rock mulch, and then a conifer, kind of like one of those overgrown little decorative conifers that you get for Christmas that someone had planted there. And it was, I will say, most wildfires occur on garbage and recycling day. There's a weird thing that happens, and so it spills all kinds of combustibles all over the place. So these folks didn't just leave their Coca-Cola box there. It was all this material that was blown around. But what's surprising to me is to see a conifer ignite without the base igniting, because the base was rock mulch. But this conifer dropped its needles and it held it within the plant. It didn't let it go. And so you basically had this perfect bird's nest tinderbox. That ignited from the embers. It's 6-7 feet tall, but the ignition of that conifer was enough to push on the under eave area, which is a fiberboard. Even though the house is stucco, there's fiberboard under eave, and then it got fire fully into the attic, and the attic was fully engaged. And we worry about kind of the vulnerabilities of fire to windows, fire to under eave areas, as well as fire to vents. So, I know some folks will say, well, why can't we just simply put a rock mulch way around, and then we can plant around that? Well, over time, if we put woody structures in there, they become additional fuel, and so you have to be able to fast forward to what that planting is going to look like through time. So I'm going to wrap up on some of this home hardening place to say that it's all pretty predictable. We can see these pathways, and what I hope to inspire in you is a sense to be able to think about the pathways for your structures and think about ways that you can break the wick. So we talked about fence to houses, so that's from the pictures taken from the Tubbs fire. We talked a little bit about roof and roof edges and gutters, and that gutters basically are great collectors, and depending on how the edge detail of the roof is, you can get a gutter fire, and that fire can then go underneath the roofing and get into the roof decking and into the attic. We're going to talk about vents in a minute, but there's also these transition points where we have complex roof lines, where we've got roof-to-wall interactions, and we may have a Class A roof. It could be metal, it could be something that we feel really good about, but we've got wood siding right adjacent to that, and so you're asking the siding to perform as well as the roofing does. And that's a big lift. There are things that we can do to be able to manage that detail, both in a design and retrofit space. So you could take off in this case, you've got a dormer. You could take off that cladding, that siding. You could add some gypsum board and increase the fire rating on that wall. You could also flash it with a lot more effort. So it's a small section. You could put non-combustible boards on the outside of it. So at the time of roof repair, maybe you also do that wall component right there. I think you all know where the debris accumulates on your roof. You know where the problem areas are. So being aware of the vulnerabilities that those places have are important. How am I doing time-wise? I feel like I'm running out of time. I'm going to end after vents because I think vents are really just super important here. So most of us, why do we have vents in our houses? Moisture, right? Because otherwise our buildings rot from the inside out. And we've got to be able to manage that moisture load. Most of us have screen on our venting to keep the animals out and to keep some of the insects out, which is important. And that screening has conventionally been about 1/4 inch in mesh size. So I have some examples of that here somewhere. And the problem with that screening is that it allows things to get on the inside. And so what we're encouraging people to do is think about the vulnerability that offers and then add some additional screening to your existing vents. And so I'm going to show you this next little video here. So this is the 1/4 inch mesh screen, and you have to hit the play button. Right there. And this is the embers that are coming through 1/4 inch mesh screen. So they can get through. And the question is whether they find something receptive on the inside. If they're of something that's woody, there's a good potential for ignition, and this is how the building appears to burn from the inside out. And I can't remember how long this goes. I think we can just fast forward. The point's well made here. You can go to the next slide. And so what has been created is some technological innovation, and with the finer mesh screen, it doesn't mean you won't get embers, but they won't have very much heat in them, and so they'll self-extinguish much more easily. So there's a whole new class of vents that meet Chapter 7A. So Chapter 7A is in the California Building Code, and it's for exterior performance. And these vents, and I have several examples of them, are basically designed to resist flames or embers or both. And so the mesh screen, adding the mesh screen would basically change the equation so you don't have as much bigger embers coming through. And that can be done in a low-tech way with a staple gun and just snips to be able to fit it to the right size. And if you're able to remove the fuel that might be at the base of those vents, this could be all you need to do. If for some reason you have a complicated space, then you might want to have something that resists the flames. And so there's this class of vents that have intumescent coatings in them, and I'll let you guys come up and play with it. So this one has a very fine screen on the back. It has a honeycomb that's filled with aluminum that's then been painted with this intumescent paint, and when heat gets on it, it seals up. Reminds me a lot of the worms that we used to play with in firecrackers as kids. Those little smoldering black worms that kind of ooze along. They sort of it sort of oozes in and seals up the vents. It takes a little while. This one, when I played with it, took almost a minute to seal up, so it's not instantaneous. And I've lost a little bit over the years. There's another example of one. This is got a tortured path, so it's got a screen on the back. But the embers have to make some tight corners, like a labyrinth, and it's hard to get them to go through that. So those are a couple of examples. There are some for through roof vents, like the one shown in B there, that allows air circulation and can prevent the ember entry. Okay, let's see what else is left, and then I think I'll wrap up. So with our lovely Kathy Weber, we've got a lot of resources around how to think about these issues. There's a whole lot of information in this space. And I know we wanted to talk about insurance, so I spent most of my time talking about that, but let's just sort of go through the key pieces. So the roof needs to be Class A. Anybody know what a Class A roof is? Right, so it's a rated roof. You can even get Class A with roll roofing, but it's by assembly, so you need to have plywood, tar paper, and the roll roofing together to get the Class A standard. Metal is a Class A standalone, so it stands alone on its own. So you have to understand kind of what the system is and what it's intended to do. But the point is that the roof is the largest horizontal surface on the building, and it is shouldering the majority of the responsibility to protect that structure from rain, from wind, from hail, and also from fire. And that Class A rating means that it's able to withstand some degree of burning on the exterior of that roofing product. So you'll see those damaged photographs, or the photographs of damaged homes, and you'll see that there's charring on some of the roof. That's okay. You know, it's doing its job. But there are vulnerable spots. So like that transition to the dormer, of course, is a vulnerable location. So the roof is not only the overall main component of it, it's also a lot of the details, like the edge. We talked a little bit about gutter guards and gutters. So things that keep the debris out of the gutters is important. There's no rated gutter guards out there. I think they all pretty much are terrible. But figuring out a system that works for you and your structure, where you've got a multi-storied building, you can get in, it's hard to get in there, or a single-story building where it's easier to get in there, or you're getting on in years and so you shouldn't be on a ladder. There's a lot of things to think about there. But with the gutter, you need to have a metal drip edge, which is that flashing detail that finishes off the corner of the roof itself. This little flashing detail, and where is my gutter? Makes a whole lot of difference. Not expensive. If you're doing it yourself, you just have to make sure you include that. If you hire someone to do the roof, they will take care of that. Let's talk about decks for a second. Anyone have a deck in this room? God, a deck's beautiful. Really, my greatest joy is on a deck most of the time. Decks themselves are a bit of a challenge, and the biggest challenge is how we manage them. Because there's this great out of sight, out of mind kind of place that's that secret place underneath the deck, and we store all kinds of stuff there, don't we? Anybody got any building products left under their old boards, maybe? They're sitting on a nice pallet, because you can't see them. Right? Thank you for passing me up. Anyone have what else do you have under the deck? You've got a cat? Okay, let's not roast the cat. What else do people have under the deck? Right? There's a long list of stuff we put under the deck. And so the embers themselves, or the direct flames, are going to run up to the base and underneath the deck, and what do? They ignite it, right? And so then you've got flame underneath the deck, and then you can get an easy exposure to the underside of the deck, and then the deck ignites, and the fire can run to the structure. So many wildland firefighters and city firefighters know that the deck is the place to worry about. So no debris under it. Really keeping it clean. If you've got a problematic deck, screening it with this kind of mesh screening to keep the embers out. If you were to seal it up, what do you also need to do if you seal up the deck? You have to vent it, right? Because you've got lots of moisture coming in from the top, from the rain that's coming through. So, you have to think about it as a whole system.
Get the cat out.
I know, the cat. I'm really worried about the cat. I have a cabin that has to do well on its own. I use a bunch of old, crappy roofing that I just lay metal roofing sheets under there, especially on the grass side where the sun comes in. And I'm just trying to do small things that can make a difference to try and keep the amount of combustibles out. So decks, there's also different ways to build decks, and this metal bitumen tape is one of the keys to it. So if you're installing a new deck, there's some great guidance on how to do that better, which include basically capping the deck joists with bitumen tape. or some other type of flashing. And why would you do that? Sounds kind of crazy, doesn't it? So the embers are going to come through, and they may ignite that joist. And if you have metal on the top of that joist, it will prevent a smoldering fire that wicks basically down that joist, which tends to come in at a perpendicular and bring the fire directly to the structure. You can also take the last two deck boards and change them out and put a non-combustible board in there or a non-combustible grate, so that if you do get ignition, it might stop when it gets close to the primary structure. So there's just some thought you can do into decks. I don't have it. I've tried to retrofit. It's a little hard. It's hard to get those deck screws out. They tend to break their heads, and so these are more actions that you can take at the new installation or the repair phase. But the big element is taking care of what's underneath that deck. And then, here's another important detail. So the fence. I'm not saying no fence, but changing the way that fence attaches to the structure is what we're talking about now. And how you can put a non-combustible panel there or a non-combustible gate, and that will basically break the path of that wildland fire. If you haven't gotten there yet, when you're evacuating, at least tie that gate open. Really anchor it, because wind is going to rattle that. But that would be a simple way that you could start by, to break that pathway if you're still home. And then we've talked about vents, and that's vents everywhere, so it extends to all the different components of vents. I even have some examples of both the Vulcan and the Brand Guard versions of these kind of freeze block vents. So they make them in all different sizes and forms and shapes, so there's a lot of opportunity there. If you're building in boxed in eaves, far better than having those vented eaves. And then when it comes to the windows, double pane, always better than single pane, and working with the exposures to those windows, so upgrading at least the sides of the buildings where you're likely to have two structures interacting with each other, or some kind of fuel that's close to it interacting with that window. So then you would use a higher performance glass in that situation. So I think with that, I'm going to wrap it up. I'll take some questions, and then I'd be happy to talk to people about different building products if they're interested in that. And just want to applaud you all for coming out on a Saturday and for all this work you do to support your community and lift your community. Oh, and let me close with Tanner. Do you want to talk about the great work that's happening in the broader area and sort of give us a little highlight about the work in Shelter Cove?
Yeah, thank you. We just talked for a second before about how this ties into some of the work that is happening in the area. There are a couple pretty exciting programs that are starting this summer. The Southern Humboldt Defensible Space Program, which is being implemented by the Bryceland Volunteer Fire Department. That's in partnership with the County Public Works Natural Resources Planning. And that's going to entail firefighters who are doing home risk assessments to do exactly what Yana was just talking about with the landowners there, walk around their houses, do an assessment, and a home risk assessment we call it, and then identify the hazardous fuels around their house. And then it's going to be followed up by a fuels crew coming from Bryceland, also firefighters that are being employed to come and remove all the hazardous vegetation from around 100 feet of their house. So this is going to be offered to vulnerable populations in the Southern Humboldt area. We're going to start with the phase 1 in the Edwardsburg, Bryceland, Whitethorn area and move out from there. We're aiming to do 90 to 120 houses this season, hopefully. So it's a pretty big deal for us on many levels. We've been working for this kind of project, in mind, both with firefighters employed and to try to help our most vulnerable residents in the area. So please put the word out. We're signing people up now. You can talk to a member of the Bryceland Fire Department. Joel Dillon right there is the grant program manager. And Kai, as you might all know from the prescribed burn world and Bryceland Fire Department, talk to any of them, or you can talk to me. Also in Shelter Cove, we're starting a massive project out there too. It's the Wildfire Defense Grant that Chief Pape was talking about earlier, and that's going to address every single house and property in Shelter Cove. It's a 5-year project, but that's going to get a home risk assessment and a defensible space treatment for over 550 houses. So it's a major one. That's kind of historic proportions. It's potentially one of the biggest grant projects of that type to do every single house in the community. So it's a major one too. And yeah, basically this is all coming from, I think, the culture that Yana and Southern Humboldt Fire Safe Council has really been promoting, and it's starting to really hit the ground in a big way now. So it's really exciting. And but just to remember that for all of us who are at home and can do the work, to start where you can. My personal experience from this has come to that, tying into how are we all going to live here, is that this actually stacks really well with kind of a minimalism culture. I've seen, as we've all developed homesteads, oftentimes they do get very complex, and we have lots of buildings and stuff. And it seems like if we're getting poorer anyway, less stuff, right? Get rid of stuff, simplify it. One of the when I was helping with the FireWise assessment in Benbow, I got the opportunity to go to the Daeshu West Buddhist temple up there, and was really inspired by how they used sand and gravel in a really clean, simple way. It looked really nice as far as a way to come up with a non-combustible surface. In some ways, that place had some exposures, but also in other ways, it was really simple because there wasn't a lot of stuff around, So any way we can reduce stuff and try to find how to make simple to maintain surfaces. Thank you.
There's big ups. I mean, when Tanner told me this last week, it actually brought tears to my eyes to think that we've hit that threshold and we're actually going to try full saturation in the community. I mean, that is leading the way. It is outstanding work, and it is really about how do we build and bring diversified skill sets together, how do we really lift each other together, and how do we figure out what it means to live in this complex state that has burned forever, and then we need to use fire to be able to maintain that. But we sort of put that out of sight, out of mind, and thought it wasn't really going to affect us. Well, payback's a bitch, right? And so here we are, adjusting in this space. I want to point out, because I'm thinking about jobs, that gate over there, huge space for innovation. There's no one that is making beautiful gates yet that you can just buy off the shelf and be able to install. So anyone has some vision, huge opportunity. I kind of want a side hustle, so if you want to do it, I'd join you maybe in it. But a really nice way to think about what are those new products that we're going to need to be able to help people feel that this is possible. And what we need are a lot of folks that can say, I get it. I get this one the most. Grandma's roses are going to have to move. You're telling me that we have to move Grandma's roses? And I'm like, yeah, I am telling you, you got to move Grandma's roses. Because what are you going to regret? What's within your power? What can you do that makes a difference? And so figure it out for your community and figure it out for your families. You get together at the holidays with your kids. They got stronger backs than we do now. So bring them in to do a day of project work and talk about all the good stuff and remember what it's like to live in this beautiful place. Yes, it's a yes and yes, right? And everybody has a talent to bring. And so we could do the vent project. We could, work around up the driveway, up the neighborhood and do the vent project. Someone could put a pair of gloves on and snip to the right size. Someone can be on the gladder. Someone can use a staple gun. Someone can be making coffee. It doesn't have to be super talented work. We just need to figure out how we lift together, because all boats rise together. So thanks for coming out, and I'm happy to take questions later.
Thank you, Yana, presentation. Who did not learn something today? Okay, thank you, right? So I want to encourage you to go back and bring some things home to your family if you haven't already gotten your fill. There's lots of stuff left in the kitchen. I want to thank so many people for being here. All of our sponsors, Rob Seifert, can't do it without you ever. All the panelists, and Kathy Weber, Gail Eastwood, set up, take down, thank you, Gray. The Mateel, yes, all the angels in the kitchen, Everyone that donated food, everything's been donated as far as the food, and all the proceeds go to the Southern Humboldt Fire Safe Council, I do believe. And that all the Firewise groups, all the fire safe councils, thanks to all the community that supports us and the information getting out that helps all of us become safer and more wise with fire. Thanks to everyone that came. I think we're all related, but thanks to Emily and for taking such good care of the kids zone. It's absolutely wonderful over there. Duff, thank you so much for videoing, and this will be available at SoHum Fire Safe Council's website. The entire thing has been videoed, so what else did I want to tell? Oh, the public meetings of the Southern Humboldt Fire Safe Council, everyone is welcome. They are the first Thursday of every month from 5 o'clock, and they're pretty swift and they go really well, and there is massive amounts of information to be shared there. So if you want to know what's going on and you couldn't retain everything that you had heard here today, you can go there and you can find out more. And what else do I want to tell you? Yeah. Thank you all for making your places a lot more safe for all of us and your continued interest and support in doing so. Thanks, everybody.